Chapter 24, Life in the Emerging Urban Society. So we're pretty much going to look at what urban life was like in the 17 and 1800s for rich and poor and those in between. Taming the city. And we're starting with industry and the growth of cities. The main causes of the poor quality of city life in the early 18th century were a lack of medical knowledge, deadly overcrowding, and pervasive poverty. And making this worse was that these things had existed for hundreds of years by the 1700s. And the masses of people lived in really close proximity to each other, to the shops, and to the markets, really because they had to. And so city dwellers were packed tightly together and were always more likely to die from the spread of an infectious disease than were their rural counterparts. With the invention of the steam engine, industrialists no longer had to build factories near streams and rivers. So really they had every incentive to build these new factories in urban areas. Large cities in England and Wales jumped from about 1.5 million people in 1801 to 6.5 million in 1851, and eventually reached 15.6 million in 1891. So that's going from 17% of the population of England and Wales to 54% of the population of England and Wales that moved to these urban areas, just adding to the crowding and disease. Buildings were, of course, erected on the smallest possible lots. Narrow houses were built wall to wall in long rows, so that they could pack the maximum number of people into any given space. And of course, these highly concentrated urban populations lived in extremely unsanitary and unhealthy conditions. There were open drains, sewers flowing alongside or down the middle of unpaved streets. Toilet facilities were primitive at best. The sewage occasionally seeped into cellar dwellings, and dung hills accumulated in some courtyards in poor neighborhoods. And so the crucial factors behind these conditions were the tremendous pressure of overcrowding and the total absence of public transportation. The government in Great Britain, both local and national, were slow to provide sanitary facilities or to establish adequate building codes. So these conditions remained this way until there was an intentional reform movement. So late in the 18th century, there was a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, and I will spell that for you. Jeremy Bentham. And he developed the concept of utilitarianism. I should probably write that too. Utilitarianism. And this was basically the idea that to solve social issues, like the public problems we just mentioned in this last bullet point, people should use, or governments should use, rational, scientific methods to deal with these problems instead of just going, hey, the greatest good for the greatest number. So he was really the first to initiate reform, and to do so using science, pretty much. Edwin Chadwick, this is another name, another important name. So Chadwick was a follower of Bentham's principles, and he was an early reformer. And he postulated that disease and death actually caused poverty, because a sick worker was an unemployed worker, and orphaned children were poor children. So Chadwick collected detailed reports on the sanitary conditions of the laboring populations. And in 1842, he published evidence proving that disease was related to filthy environmental conditions, which were in turn caused largely by lack of drainage, lack of sewage systems, lack of garbage collection. And so he correctly believed that the stinking excrement of the communal outhouses could be carried off by water through sewers at less than 1/20th of the cost of removing it by hand. And so they put in cheap iron pipes and tile drains, produced in the good old industrial age, and it would provide running water and sewage for all sections of towns, not just the wealthy ones. And in 1848, this was 2 years after the cholera epidemic of 1846, his report became the basis of Great Britain's first public health law. And this law basically gave cities the authority to build modern sanitation systems based on Chadwick's model. And so the government accepted at least limited responsibility for the health of its citizens. And by 1870, cities were beginning to make real progress toward adequate water supplies and sewage systems. The bacterial revolution. And this is the part where scientists figure out that it is microscopic, tiny bacteria that cause diseases and not filth. Although the filth causes it to spread, it's not the reason behind the disease. I'm going to throw some names at you here. You've probably heard some of them before. Louis Pasteur, from where we get the term pasteurization. You see that on your milk. It's pasteurized. He was a French chemist who studied the fermentation for brewers in 1854 when he developed the germ theory of disease. And he found that fermentation depended on the growth of tiny living organisms, and the activity of these organisms could be suppressed by heating the beverage or by pasteurizing it. Probably the best way to clean tools or even cooking utensils, if they're soiled or whatever, for whatever reason, is to boil it. And he was the first to figure this out. If you can heat something to a certain temperature, then it will kill or severely limit those bacteria. Another name, German country doctor Robert Koch, I might be butchering his name, and his co-workers developed pure cultures of harmful bacteria and studied and described their life cycles. Other early scientists identified the organisms responsible for various diseases and then were able to develop effective vaccines. And so germ theory dramatically improved hospital and surgery environments, especially when English surgeon Joseph Lister determined that applying a chemical disinfectant to a wound dressing would kill the bacteria. That was a great discovery, and it sounds like common sense today, but we wouldn't have known it if not for Lister. In the 1880s, German surgeons began to sterilize not only the wound, but everything. Their hands, their clothing, medical instruments, anything that entered the operating room, they sterilized it. And so the achievements of the bacterial revolution, coupled with public health movement, saved millions of lives. And this was reflected as mortality rates began to decline dramatically in European countries. Yellow fever, cholera, typhus, typhoid became vanishing diseases. And so by 1910, the death rates for people of all ages in urban areas were generally no greater than those living out in the country. Improvements in urban planning, and this really just looks at how, especially in France, they began to change the way cities were built. And more effective urban planning was another major key to a better quality life for urban dwellers. And this really sort of kicked off with Napoleon III. He decided that he wanted to rebuild much of Paris because it would provide employment, it would improve living conditions, and most importantly to him, it would testify to the glory of his empire. So he appointed a person, Baron George Haussmann, to be the planner, to bulldoze everything and to start over. And so looking at life in Paris before Haussmann, Paris of 1850 was pretty much a labyrinth of narrow, dark streets, terrible slum conditions, extremely high death rates, all of which were the result of overcrowding and a lack of effective planning. And so for 20 years, he and his planners razed old buildings, not raised them up, but R-A-Z-E-D, razed, cut to the ground, old buildings, in order to cut broad, straight, three-lined boulevards that were designed to prevent the easy construction of barricades by revolutionary crowds, smart move, Haussmann, and to permit traffic to flow freely. And so the creation of these wide boulevards demolished some of the worst slums in Paris and stimulated the construction of better housing, especially for the middle classes. And they opened up parks and large open spaces throughout the city. They improved their sewage system, and created a system of aqueducts to bring water into the city, fresh, clean water into the city. And this was revolutionary. Paris really created a new model for urban planning and stimulated modern urbanism throughout Europe, especially after 1870. Vienna was quick to follow the Parisian example of tearing down old walled fortifications and replacing them with broad, circular boulevards that were lined with office buildings, theaters, town halls, and museums. So one of the things that accompanied this mass urban reconstruction was usually the development of public transportation and mass public transportation. And this greatly enhanced urban living conditions. New boulevards, horse-drawn streetcars facilitated a middle-class move to better and more spacious housing in the 1860s and 70s. And later on in the 1890s, many European countries even adopted the electric streetcar, which was faster, it was cheaper, more dependable, cleaner, and more comfortable than horse-drawn carriages. Good mass transit meant that people who were poor or people with modest means could access new, improved housing, which would help the city. Even though it was still crowded, it would help the city to expand and become less congested. And aside from that, it just gave the people more mobility. And so in Europe, many city governments began to build the electric streetcar systems that would provide transportation to new housing developments for working classes beyond the city limits. And so the suburban commuting was born. Rich, poor, and those in between. And don't fear, we're not going to cover this whole slide today. We're probably actually going to stop about right there. But we're going to look first at the distribution of income. By 1850, working conditions were improving, and the majority of the population were receiving increased wages. This did not eliminate hardship or poverty. These greater economic rewards didn't really equalize wealth or close the gap between rich and poor. In almost every advanced country around 1900, the richest 5% of households in the population had about a third of the national income. So the top 5% had about 33% of the income, and the bottom 30% of all households received about 10% or less of all income. And so the gap between rich and poor continued to be enormous, and It endured in part because industrial and urban development made society more diverse but less unified. Or I guess that would be more diverse and less unified. But economic specialization enabled society to produce more effectively and in the process created more new social groups because there was almost an unlimited range of jobs, skills, and earnings developed. And so this social and occupational hierarchy had enormous variations. Even just within the middle class or the lowest class, there were many variations. But the middle class nor the working class really acted as a unified force in European countries. So let's look at some of those variations. That brings us to the people and occupations of the middle class. So what were these people doing that was so diverse? For the upper middle class, there were mostly successful business families, and they continued to gain an income and were progressively drawn upward toward an aristocratic lifestyle. The much larger, much less wealthy, and increasingly diversified middle class groups included industrialists, merchants, lawyers, doctors, and then below this comfortable middle class were independent shopkeepers, small traders, tiny manufacturers, not like little, but they were manufacturing on a small scale. And this was the lower middle class. But as industry and technology expanded, a demand for experts with specialized knowledge grew. And with this came an advance in education, and that soared in importance among middle classes. They wanted their children to be educated. So engineers, architects, chemists, accountants, surveyors began to achieve professional standing in this period and establish criteria for advanced training and certification. In addition to this, there were many other white-collar people with complex technical skills who were trying to work to achieve professional standing and middle-class status, like elementary school teachers and nurses who rose from the lower ranks of unskilled labor into professional standing. And dentistry even was taken out of the hands of working-class barbers and placed into the hands of highly trained professionals. So we see even within the middle class, there were extremely diverse occupation and specialization of labor. And so we'll end there and we'll pick up in the next video with middle class culture and values.